Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. Thank you again for joining us. I would like to introduce Dr. Seth Jones, Senior Vice President and Director of the International Security Program here at CSIS. Seth has done incredibly important work on the defense industrial base, defense posture, China, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, terrorism, many themes likely to come up in his panel discussion. We are incredibly fortunate and honored to be joined by all 6 Vice Chiefs of Staff of the military services. The theme of today's forum is Gathering Strength, how we muster sources of American strength to navigate the security challenges facing our country. Our military forces are a source of American strength, but our military advantage is not guaranteed. The panel will discuss what it takes to maintain that advantage and to prepare for this different security environment that we are facing. So I'm pleased to hand off to Seth to discuss these issues with the Vice Chiefs. Seth.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and thanks to all the team that put this Global Security Forum together. Where we sit, for those of you who are just joining us, is we started off looking at broad strategic questions. We'll move from this to the intelligence picture from the Director of National Intelligence to the thoughts of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and we'll move in the afternoon to the defense industrial base and then emerging technologies. The theme of the Global Security Forum really does pick up on Winston Churchill's The Gathering Storm. As Kerry mentioned earlier, his book, The Gathering Storm, which came out 1948, looked at the geopolitical changes. I'm actually in the middle of reading Andrew Roberts' nearly 1,000-page biography of Churchill, and it also feels a little bit like the Churchill position in the 1930s, where he is looking at German rearmament and pushing the UK to take the threat seriously, of which much of the leadership in the House of Commons and within 10 Downing Street does not take the threat seriously, which puts the British in a very difficult position as the Germans start to move on Poland and other countries. I'd like to start with General Mingus first, then go to General Mahoney, and then open it up to anybody else here who wants to weigh in. I want to start with sort of the current wars both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. The focus of our panel, and thanks to all of you for joining, is on the future of warfare. But part of the question really is, what are you seeing, General Mingus, as you look at Ukraine, which is now in its 3rd year? There's been some interesting innovation. I was over there a few weeks ago to talk to senior Ukrainian forces about innovation, but there's a lot there. We would certainly fight differently. In many ways, we have different capabilities, but precision strike, logistics, integrated air and missile defense, electronic warfare. And then when we move over to the Middle East, the active war in Gaza, the fighting we've seen, the back and forth along the Lebanese-Israel border, the Red Sea dimension, obviously the Iranian strikes against Israel and the Israeli response. So as you look at this picture, where we are and where we've come from following the Russian invasion, what are you seeing in terms of some of the primary lessons from the current wars, and how are you looking at adapting and evolving the Army based on those?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Seth. I guess I would start with 2014 instead of 2022, because 2014, a lot of people forget that that's when this really started. And we've had teams embedded over in Europe and in Ukraine since the original incursion in 2014. It's obviously taken it's gone to a whole different level after 2022. We continue to pull all those things. We embed those in our combat training centers. But I'll go back to where I started in the gap analysis that we did 2015, 2016 timeframe. Our adversaries have been watching us for a long time. And what they have, I think, come to the conclusion is they don't want to get into a close fight with the United States of America. And so they've developed a series of preclusionary tactics. Many call it A2AD or anti-access aerial denial, where they want to be able to sense further, shoot further, see us further, disrupt us further, so they don't ever have to experience that close fight component. The proliferation of technology as it's come on, the fact that you can't hide anywhere, air, land, sea, space. I mean, everything is ubiquitous in terms of where things are going, and so we're trying to learn from that. Where we're trying to go inside the Army is to the ability to counter that. So it really boils down to command and control, our long-range precision fires. How do we keep pace with technology when it comes to unmanned systems? How do we pull all that together in a way that's coherent in the way that we're going to fight today and in the future? Working with all the services that are here today, I think a lot of those lessons learned are universal. But at the end of the day, we've got to be able to match the adversary when it comes to long-range precision fires, contested logistics, and command and control.
So one item, if I can just do a follow-up there, one item that the Joint Warfighting Concept 3.0 highlights is the challenge in this environment of maneuver.
Yeah.
So how are you thinking about maneuver in this environment?
So the cornerstone behind the Joint Warfighting Concept 3.0 is the term expanded maneuver. I like to view it as we have expanded the definition of maneuver. Maneuver in its classic sense is geographical, it's movement and fires. So you move to be able to place better fires on the adversary, and place fires on the enemy so you can move. And those things are inextricably linked. But you can also move in cyberspace. You can move in space. You can have effects in space. You can have effects in cyber. You can have effects in air. And so the classic definition of maneuver, as we have all, which is one of the 9 principles of war, has expanded, and we've got to embrace that.
Thanks. General Mahoney, I wonder if we can come to you next, and then I'm going to actually move to the Red Sea after that, and then open it up to anybody else who wants to comment.
Sure, maybe just a couple of fill-ins on a pretty great response by my fighting mate over there. I think the first thing is if you're facing a competent or much less a near-peer adversary, the idea of short and sharp conflict is probably a thing of the past. If we look specifically at Ukraine, 2 years plus on, that has been the definition of not short and sharp. And when we go to this Red Sea, we can talk about our counter moves against the Houthis, which they're very difficult to uproot, and that is continuing now. So protraction in time, I think, is a foregone conclusion, and that connotes the requirement to remove, reset, repair, and then reintegrate into the fight. It also connotes depth of magazine, which we see right at the forefront in Ukraine with our national security supplemental that was just passed. So if we think that is going to be delimited in time due to our choosing, we may want to think again about that. The second was brought up, and maybe just a different perspective on it, and that's observation. You will be seen. You'll be seen in the visual spectrum. You'll be seen in the IR spectrum. You'll be seen in the EM spectrum. So you have to then integrate the ability to either camouflage, deceive, maneuver in order to make that observation less consequential. And we're seeing that in spades in the Ukraine-Russia example. Maybe specific to Marine Corps capabilities, in the Black Sea and certainly in the Red Sea, but I'll keep it contained to the Black Sea until we move on, is this idea of landward littorals impacting the seaward maneuver space. Small, distributed units with the ability to sense and fire have sunk at least 13, 14, 15 Russian ships. You know, Nelson said a ship's a fool to fight a fort, and when they did, they figured out that maxim, although old, is probably still pretty true. Then you can go to Mahan, who said, without protection from the littorals, without protection from the landward side, you have a fortress fleet, where the fleet cannot sortie much beyond its protection from the land. And we've seen that happen in the Black Sea as the Russians have retrenched to the eastern portion, enabled a grain corridor to open up, and enabled more freedom of movement by the Ukrainians. So small, maneuverable, distributed units that have a long-range precision fires from the landward littorals to the sea is what is a big lesson for us.
So one follow-up, if I can, is one of the challenges both with the Russians and the Ukrainians as the war has been protracted is their industrial bases and ensuring that forces on the ground have sufficient artillery, fire, air defense capabilities. So how do you think, as we look towards the possibility of protracted conflict, how are you thinking about whether it's stockpiles or just the broader industrial base and some of the challenges that we have? How does that impact how the Marine Corps is thinking about this?
Well, I think on the far backside, you need to have an industrial base that can either produce at scale right now or ramp up very quickly to produce, to build that depth of magazine. On our side, we have to have the ability to source those weapons at the time and place of our choosing. So you marry those up, and you need a different relationship right now, I think, between the operating forces as it goes back through to the defense industrial base. And I think you just wrote a piece on empty bins about the time frame through TTXs and war games, where we would go through some of our preferred munitions in a matter of days, if not weeks. There has to be an appreciation for that on the military side, and there has to be an appreciation for that on the defense industrial base side.
Can I just throw a red flag for pandering to the moderator? I think.
Oh, I'm not done, Jim. I'm just. That's nothing. I'm just starting.
This is already, I've lost control of the panel right now.
I want to just make a comment, Seth, though, and then I'll go to the Red Sea piece. But I won't quote Mahan, but I will quote Steve Lazuski from 2020 when we did a panel about force design from the Marine Corps. Like, hey, what's this all about? And he said something, Mo, about flipping the script. Like, we tend to think of Marines going in one direction from sea to shore, and this flips that script. And what's happening in the Black Sea is evidence to that effect that we should look towards and think about, and you are doing that, and we should do that. From a Red Sea perspective, it takes a joint force for this big fight we're preparing for. Everybody brings something to that game. The Navy brings a mobility aspect with the Marine Corps when we don't have basing rights that are helpful, and we didn't at the beginning of this conflict. What we found, though, is we had to adapt. Every day we had to adapt. The adversary was going to adapt. They were going to change their tactics. They were going to watch us. We should assume that's going to happen, and we need to get better. What we had to do from a technology perspective is really tighten up the data reduction and introspection of, did the system perform as we thought it would? If it didn't, what can we do about that? Did the humans perform as we thought they would? If they didn't, what can we do about that? And provide that lesson to the fleet. So to me, there's a very quick learning cycle here that can be applied, now aided by technology, to take a data reduction and send it to shore and really look and see what the system did. So I think that's to our benefit, and we should use it for every ounce we can provide.
One issue I think that has come out of the Red Sea, and I'm curious how you're thinking about it, is we're certainly trading off when we shoot down drones or cruise missiles, some pretty expensive systems for, particularly in some of the drones, the UASs, some pretty cheap ones. So how are you thinking about, as you look towards the future, ways to, for counter UAS, for example, that's a slightly better trade-off on cost?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely an emphasis and a re-emphasis on counter UAS. Army's led that for a long time. Navy's focused on it from both a shore perspective and a ship perspective. And we need to do more work there because we are at the wrong end of the cost curve. But when people lure me into that discussion, Seth, I push back and say the crew of a DDG is worth more than that. So where we are now, we need to keep, we have a shot, we should take the shot.
Yeah.
And we put those commanding officers in a very tight box where they've got about 10 to 15 seconds to make the decision. So let's encumber that, and you put your system in a position, and your ship in a position where you can maximize the effect of that and do that. And then let's go reflect on this and figure out a better way to do this, maybe through some directed energy, electronic warfare, high-powered microwave things in the future. And I think we're looking at that. And we appreciate the quickness of our system to look at the ability for some of our electronic systems libraries to update them. And that's increased at pace in the Red Sea. So the intelligence community has played in this and reached the same kind of parity as us with our combat systems. And I think we just got to keep doing that.
If I could add a couple things on counter-UAS. So counter-UAS, clearly a thing today, and it's an acute threat that we're putting a lot of time, energy, and resources to try to figure out how to counter that. But in the longer term, it has to be viewed through the lens of the broader integrated air and missile defense architecture, because it is defending from the air. And in that context, the way all the services have looked at that particular problem set is we defend points on the ground or a spot on the ground or a critical asset or something fixed. That's generally how we do that. We've got to change that approach and look at it more like we would in a typical defensive posture, where you establish engagement areas and you have layered defense. You have things that can disrupt and break, and then you have that last line of defense that comes in. And the cost point, absolutely. But we're the same way when you look at the engagements that are happening. A Coyote missile is relatively expensive, but I would never question an operator. Do I shoot at 20 kilometers, or I had to wait until that thing's 1 or 2 kilometers out? So you're never going to sacrifice that decision making at the tactical level.
Seth, one thing, the flexibility of the joint force to readapt and provide additional layers of defense and depth shouldn't be lost on it. Aircraft now shooting down cruise missiles from the Air Force and the Navy and the Marine Corps. So to me, that's another thing to do exactly what Jim said. Let's not put ourselves in a box standing here with one resort.
This Jim, by the way,
that
right?
Jim.
Okay.
There's a couple of us.
There are a few Jims here, which is going to get confusing.
We like to sit together to confuse people.
I wanted to open up to see if there were any other, on this issue, current fight, any other comments?
Yeah, what I would offer first, thanks, and having read your really excellent books, I frankly should have been a Pulitzer Prize winner, in my opinion.
You're just trying to get softball questions, I know that.
The best way to deter is to be prepared to fight and be perceived as being prepared to fight. And so as we think about kind of the strategic environment we're in many ways, these are the interwar years. You started off talking about the gathering storm. So what was going on during the gathering storm, right? The Spanish Civil War. There was a lot of lessons to be learned in the Spanish Civil War. You wonder whether things like Ukraine and what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in the Red Sea, is this the Spanish Civil War of our era? Then, shame on us if we don't learn the lessons that we need to learn in order to more effectively deter, so we don't have the storm that may be gathering. And so when you look at kind of lessons that we ought to be learning right now, I think for the Air Force, for a long, long time, we boastfully said no American has been killed by air attack since 1953. We can't say that anymore. And we can't say that anymore because our traditional conception of what things like air superiority means have changed. Quadcopters with a hand grenade can kill an American just as easily as a MiG or a Sioux can. And so as we think about what does air superiority mean in an era of proliferated small UAS and one-way attack drones and so forth, I think there are some lessons to be learned, and we're soaking that up right now. The other thing that you might think about, General Mingus talked about movement and firepower, and I think one thing that you can look at in Ukraine is it is the return of firepower. And the reason that it has become so bloody is because of the lack of ability to maneuver. One component of that is the inability of both sides to achieve air superiority in the face of a proliferated air threat and formidable air defenses. And so I think there are some lessons that we can be learning, and frankly we are. You asked about the exchange ratio. Our coalition forces had a pretty successful weekend a couple of weekends ago against a really concerted Iranian attack on Israel. And so you asked about exchange ratios. Some of what was shot down with bullets. I mean, it was 20 millimeter shells coming out of the front end of a fighter. that's a pretty favorable cost exchange right there. Now, I don't know that that's scalable, but we're thinking about, as General Mingus talked about, this layered defense, and I think it really showed the value of our work here several weeks ago.
If I could just ask one follow-up, because you mentioned air superiority, and one of the challenges, I think, in areas like the Pacific is in and around bases, for example. So how are you thinking about air superiority in the construct of base defense, including air base air defense? I realize this pulls in the Army, at least the Army, into this response as well. So how are you thinking about the jointness that's necessary? So I'm thinking like Guam, for example.
Yeah. So Guam is a particular case study, but it's a broader question than that. And one of the comparative advantages that I think the U.S. enjoys, and there are a host of them. Capital markets is a comparative advantage. Innovation in the commercial marketplace is an advantage. Empowered NCOs and petty officers across the Joint Force are a comparative advantage. Another one of our comparative advantages, frankly, is our ability to operate jointly. And so I can tell you that on the topic of air base air defense specifically, there is not a closer relationship than that, specifically between the Army and the Air Force inside the department right now, of jointly attacking this problem, looking at the analysis of what are the most effective ways to contribute to air base air defense. And I'm really encouraged by, kind of us leveraging one of our comparative advantages, which is our ability to work jointly.
Anything from either of you on current wars? We'll come back with lots of other questions, but
no, to build on what Jim just talked about our comparative advantage to operate joint. We are seeing that more than we've ever seen before, and I think it's something that our near-peer adversaries counted out against us. They didn't think we would be able to fight joint. They also didn't think we'd be able to fight with our allies. They also didn't think we were going to be able to fight with our commercial partners. So what we are learning from not only what's going on in the Middle East, but especially in Ukraine, is that we're bringing all of this to bear simultaneously on the adversary, but the adversary is also bringing similar to bear against us. So it really is going to require us to be much more integrated and networked going forward, and that's really where we're starting to spend a lot of our energy.
There's one other piece I'd like to add, which is a little more pedestrian here, but in our roles as vices, we find ourselves in similar forums. One of those is the JROC, where we meet and discuss problems at a joint level. We also go to the DMAC, which is a similar forum to do that. I think initial days here for us in this group of vices, but acknowledging the reliance on each other from a program perspective. Like, I need some stuff that the Space Force is going to give me if I'm going to close those long-range fires that Jim talked about, or the Air Force. So that understanding requires you to be a little less parochial and a little bit more thoughtful. And so, this JADC2 effort, which has been going on for quite some time, is an imperative. How we get there is what we really need to focus on so we collectively can benefit from each other.
Yeah. Micro example of a success story that we jointly share with the Marine Corps, and I'm sure the other services have them, but going back to your questions about industrial base and lessons learned, but pre-conflict, this is 155 artillery, which is one of the principal things we've been providing to Ukraine in this current conflict, and they've expended in excess of 2 million rounds of 155. Prior to February 2022, we were collectively producing between us and the Marine Corps about 14,000 rounds a month. We quickly moved that to 18, then to 24, then to 28. This month we'll produce 30. By the end of this year, we'll be at 50 and 72. And then with the supplemental that just was thankfully passed last night, we'll be at 100,000 rounds by next summer. So huge success story in terms of how working with our industrial partners, we have ramped up to a level that is going to be commensurate with the need.
Yeah. you going to jump in as well?
Yeah, I was just going to offer that we're very proud of our status as a fighting force as well, and as part of the joint force. You may be surprised to know that the United States Coast Guard is present in every single continent and embedded in every single combatant command. There's probably no greater representation of that than the 6 Coast Guard cutters and the Advanced Interdiction Team and our training teams that we have operating in the 5th Fleet in the Arabian Gulf. But for us, it's an away game. How do we fight forward? But it's also how do we ensure resiliency domestically? And so I think that's another component that we have to look at. What are we doing domestically to ensure America's resiliency if there is a conflict? For us, it's maritime resiliency, it's port infrastructure. It's how do we protect port infrastructure from threats, both malign state actors and non-state actors. So I just wanted to put that on the table because I think it's an important component when we talk about war fighting and conflict, that we not lose sight of the fact that there is going to be a huge domestic component to it. And that domestic component will involve, yes, the military services, NORTHCOM, leveraging Coast Guard responsibilities in the maritime, but also how do we leverage the interagency to support war fighting?
So one follow-up, we've talked a little bit about Ukraine, the Middle East. Can you talk a little bit about the Arctic and Antarctica? It's an area that has become increasingly contested. We've seen Russian transits in waters recently, including with some pretty sensitive materials. So, what does this area look like as well? And this may be a Navy question too.
Well, I think first it starts with the value that we provide to the joint force in gray zone activities, in that competition continuum. I think that's really where the Coast Guard thrives and perhaps where we provide the greatest return on investment. We see that in the Indo-Pacific and what we're doing, helping to build capability there, but also to provide a presence. We do that in the Gulf of Guinea and we do that around the world. But perhaps where we see the greatest geostrategic competition is in the Arctic. I'm not discounting other areas, those are important, but for us, as a matter of homeland security and homeland defense, we look at the Arctic. And we see increased human activity because of ice-free conditions, and we need to be present. We need to be present to make sure that the Arctic, which is ocean space, it has good maritime governance, that sovereign rights and sovereignty are protected, and that the rule of law is respected. And we are losing ground because we don't have the kind of ice-breaking capability of some of our near-peer competitors. Russia has 40-plus icebreakers and wants to increase their fleet. China, PRC, is building ice-breaking capability for both the high latitudes, the north and the south. We have one heavy icebreaker and one medium icebreaker. Now, the good news is that we are full speed ahead on constructing new heavy icebreakers for the United States. These are not just Coast Guard cutters, these are national strategic assets. And I feel optimistic about where we're going to be in the future with our icebreaking capability. And FY24, we also were given authority and money to bring into the Coast Guard fleet a commercially available icebreaker. Not as capable as a heavy icebreaker, probably will be limited to the Arctic only, but that's a sign that both the administration and Congress support expanding the United States fleet of icebreakers because presence does matter.
If I could pick up on one issue, General Gutland, that you mentioned earlier, because you touched on the commercial side of this. I mean, one of the interesting things that we've seen, and this probably cuts across all the vices here, is the role of the private sector has clearly evolved. And even Ukraine is an example where we've seen on the cyber side, companies like Microsoft or FireEye become directly involved. We've seen companies become directly involved in providing software. We've seen commercial space companies. So how are you seeing the private sector evolve? What are the challenges, but also the opportunities with the role of the private sector?
So a couple of things in that. So Jim talked about the fact that we have universal lessons. Commercial is a universal lesson. If you look at our industry partners from the Civil War all the way forward, our civil partners, our industry partners have always been there, and they're always the ones that have pulled us out of the fire when the fighting got tough. They're the ones that made sure we had all the material that we needed. the services are the ones that help take care of the homeland when we were deployed forward. So it's not a new lesson that we're learning, but it's a lesson that has become more acute with space for a couple of reasons. One is when we went into the Middle East, we could quickly tell you who is Title 10, Title 50, other government agencies. These were our allies. These were our commercial partners that were not under SOFA, et cetera. When you go into space, those lines go away. There's no delineation, even to the point where Russia has come online and said anybody in space is going to be a target. So I can no longer say, hey, that's a commercial asset, don't touch it. That's an international asset, don't touch it. That's a DoD asset, don't touch it. We're all going to be operating in the same domain, fighting for the same real estate, subject to the same threats. And if that's going to be true, then we better learn how to partner. The other thing that we're learning is in space, innovation in the industry side is just going gangbusters. We're seeing more innovation come out of space today than we saw in the race to the moon. How do I take advantage of that? Because I cannot build kit fast enough to get ready for the near-peer threats that are coming after us. Therefore, I better learn how to partner. And that's partner with our allies, but it's also partnering with our industry counterparts. So we just published the commercial space strategy 2 weeks ago. Got that out the door, and that says pretty much anywhere that we can buy it, we're going to buy it before we try to build it. And then start strengthening those partnerships as much as we can. And it also has an augmentation reserve. Goes back to these universal lessons. Every other domain has a reserve component. We have the merchant marines, we have the civil air, we have all of them. So in space, we now need an augmentation, commercial augmented space reserve, which basically is going to allow us during times of peace to build those partnerships with industry, to exercise together, to share intel, to tell them how to protect and defend their systems so that when times of crisis or conflict come, we've already got the infrastructure in place, the governance in place, the contracts in place, and we're off to running as a partner from day zero.
If I could just add, where I see a need to leverage industry better is in data analytics and AI. I think we all collect a lot of data, but we haven't been able to harness that data as well as we could and make it usable. And I think there are a lot of emerging technologies out there that we need to harness because it's about fighting smarter. And you can use those data analytics and the AI to help with targeting, to become more efficient and more effective, and therefore safer as well. So I'm encouraged about where industry is going. I think we just need to catch up a little bit.
And we're seeing that in surveillance and reconnaissance. We're seeing that in machine learning. We're seeing it across the entire spectrum of services and capabilities that we need during times of crisis or conflict.
Another example of why this is so critical, in Jim 3 mentioned CJAD C2. So
Jim 3 is the one that gave you the thumbs up, by the way.
Yeah. So CJAD C2, it's not a person, place, or thing. It's not going to produce a box on the back end of this thing. It is, the C stands for combine, i.e. allies and partners. The J and the A stand for joint, all domain. And then command and control is command and control. It's been the integrating and synchronizing function of all the 7 joint functions that we have, and it's one of the most critical components of how we fight as a combined joint force. Underpinning all of that is the network that we are all developing together, and CJAD C2 is making sure that we as a joint force move together forward. Our commercial partners that are out there, and Mike was talking about the space component. So the data layer, the transport layer, the physical layer, and the application layer of the network. The data and transport layer of that network is going to be the most profound portion of how we're going to change. We've typically built things so that we can take it to the edge, but if we get the data and the transport layer right, which much of that will be in space, then there will be a day when an end user device is all that we have to carry to the edge.
That is, you hit it, but it is predicated on a common data environment. Let me give you a mundane example. The Marine Corps just got done with a full financial audit, and we got a clean opinion. On the way to get that audit, we had at least 24 different databases and systems. Well, they all said kind of the same thing, transacting from a liability side to an asset side and everything in between. They all spoke in completely different digital language, different digital languages, which took brute force to marry them up. There was no Rosetta Stone to bring all those together and make a common interface. So human intelligence had to come in order to enable the digital intelligence. So when we get after this multiple layer approach to CJAD C2, if we don't depart from a common data environment, we will be trying to brute force it in the face of an aggressive adversary.
Well, I think it's a strength that you didn't mention, Jim, and I think it's just a strength of our nation, potentially. Software development, how we do that. We're pretty Cro-Magnon used to be in the surface Navy anyway with our combat system until Aegis came along where we could update baselines. And now we have a different way to insert capability into those baselines. Mm-hmm. It's all connected to what this common thinking is, right? So the ability to kind of leave that archaic model of I'm wedded to this single vendor and be open to this other area is probably going to be just another change in how we technologically deliver capability to our military across the board. But I got to have the things Mo talked about.
Yeah, I wanted to bring in General Schleif to this because I know he's talked about this, including the challenges. If you take information collected off an F-35, for example, it's not always tagged or analyzed. Information sometimes segregated from one another, meaning it can't be used to create accurate service-wide solutions. So what along these lines, what are you, can you outline the challenge first and how are you thinking about collecting and processing the data more broadly?
Yeah, you're hearing it here among the vice chiefs. We all tend to go to the, what I would describe as kind of the 4 A's that we're after. Accessibility. When I ask a question, I want to be able to access the data that allows me to answer the question that I'm asking. Automation, our ability to make routine tasks that are presently done by humans so that they can be done by machines. We've done this in stovepipes for years. Admiral Kilby talked about the Aegis system. The Aegis system has had the ability to operate an air defense system in an automated role for decades, frankly. And so this is not a new idea. The third A is analytics. We want to be able to generate insights that might not otherwise be obvious to us. One of the examples that I've used is the amount of bus traffic, data bus traffic, that goes back and forth on an aircraft on every single flight. And at the end of the flight, that data bus traffic is largely discarded because it has served the purpose for which it was designed. But if we were to collect that data bus traffic, what we might gain is analytic insights into when a part is going to break that allows us to not order parts before we need them, but also allows the parts to be available so that it doesn't break. Scheduled maintenance on an aircraft is way more efficient than unscheduled maintenance. And if you wait for the part to break, by definition, you're creating unscheduled maintenance for yourself. So analytics. And then finally, the last A is AI. And so we tend to kind of leap to the use cases, but the thing that underpins all 4 of these A's is data. And I think General Mingus has got it exactly right. We need common standards. We need common processes. It's a cultural problem as much as everything else because, we have this fear that if I expose my data to the Navy, somehow Admiral Kilby is going to figure out a way to use it to disadvantage the Air Force. And so, I have to protect my data from somebody else because we have parochial interests around that. We have to knock that down. And I think that is where the value of the degree of collaboration and teamwork that the panelists here share as part of the JROC and all those other venues makes all the difference in the world.
And it's not just altruistic, though I'd like to think we're all reasonable people. It's the necessity.
That's right.
That my weapon cannot exist on my organic data anymore for the full completion of that flight, I've got to get an in-flight update or some information to that missile for it to be effective. So we have to rely on each other. It's a necessity.
It's been highlighted, but I'll just really foot stomp the idea that each of us has come to recognize the reliance that we share on one another's systems, data, the architectures that we share. Frankly, it's allowed us to become a more aware joint force as we understand where the elements of reliance are. That allows me to, go to Capitol Hill, for example, and talk about why this Army system is important to the Air Force. If that Army system is not there when we need it, the Air Force can't do its job. And so we become a more effective joint force by integrating at the data level.
Yeah, I think if I could just offer, I think there's also sort of an underlying challenge here about how we avoid technical obsolescence. One way is to have shared technologies, shared data analytics. But I also think we have to look hard at our acquisition processes to make sure that they're agile enough to keep pace with changing technology. And the last thing I just mentioned is I think there can be...
Does that include upgrading to systems?
Upgrading systems, absolutely. And I think the other dynamic tension is between owning technology as a service or buying technology as a service. I think we just got to be smart about how we draw that balance. There are some systems, there's some technology we need to own, and we need to take responsibility for that. But there are others that perhaps we can just buy as a service. I think what's required, though, is stable and predictable funding as we move forward. If we have stable and predictable funding that can project out service needs, provided we can have a strong mission needs statement or requirements process, I think stable and predictable funding is one of the best things we can do to avoid technical obsolescence.
It's a potential kind of an operational vignette to describe what my colleagues have talked about and the importance of the data components of this. So a lot of discussion out there inside the department about data integration, and data integration is great. It's a great first step, but it's insufficient. We need to move towards data mesh, then data convergence, then data replication, and then data reconciliation on the back end of that to get after all the things the 4 A's that Jim described. But then you translate that over to I think most people have heard of the cognitive hierarchy. Anytime you move into a new problem set, you're given a new mission, you're exposed to something that you have not seen before. Everybody starts off at that data layer, and then we climb up into information, then knowledge, and then understanding, and then we have shared understanding. And once you've kind of ascribed to that across a large formation, it allows leaders to then be able to visualize, describe, direct, assess, and now you're kind of back through that loop again. But in the course of a campaign or in the course of an operation, every time something changes in the environment, we immediately get drugged back down into that data layer, and we have to crawl back out of it. So the automation things and the AI tools that Jim is describing will help us stay above that fray and move much, much faster than our adversaries. And so that's the power of how, when this all comes together, we will ultimately be faster than our enemy.
I wanted to come back to the issue that we're dealing with today, which is sort of the gathering storm, and to go to Admiral Kilby first along these lines. I mean, the Russian industrial base is clearly on a wartime footing. It is in a war. But I wonder, from your perspective, as you look at the Chinese, I mean, our general assessment is the Chinese defense industrial base is on a wartime footing. That doesn't necessarily mean war is imminent, but it means that they are producing weapons and systems and preparing for a fight with the United States. The shipbuilding and the naval capacity is impressive, at least in the capacity of the Chinese to build. So I think in the environment in the Indo-Pacific, in the fiscal environment that the U.S. is in right now, I'm not sure we're going to see growth in the defense budget, and certainly the major growth and defense budget as a percentage of GDP. If you look at the Bill LaPlante, who's going to be here this afternoon, has repeatedly reminded many of us that the defense budget as a percentage of GDP during the Cold War was at various stages 14%, even during the 1980s, over 6%, between 6 and 7%. We are in the 3% range. But in the fiscal environment we're in, what is competing in the maritime space look like to you? How are you working through issues like readiness and the industrial base as you deal with the Chinese?
Yeah, that's a big question, right? And I was talking to my staff on the way over here. Historically, if you look at the shipbuilding base, it went from 21 shipyards or so after the end of World War II to 8 now that build Navy ships. And our commercial shipbuilding industry is largely the same. You know, I don't know what the fraction is of what we can build compared to China, but it's crushing. And so that would take some time to kind of repivot back to that. Yeah, the Secretary of the Navy has talked about maritime statecraft and how do we kind of enliven the industrial base to do things like the Chinese are doing, where they can build multiple ships in that. It's not just a Navy shipyard, it's a shipyard that can service many needs. So reestablishing that balance, I think, is we're out of balance now from a shipbuilding perspective. However, in the last panel, I think Michelle Flournoy talked about the replicator process. And that's touching yards that don't build big capital ships, that could build unmanned surface vessels that could complement our force in a hybrid way. So I think we should be thinking about it in that perspective. Not to trivialize the fact that we don't need to do that former. We do need to do the former. And we need to be better at it, and we need to get the ships out on time and return to a system that's level and that's predictable, and not just from a ship perspective, but from a munition perspective. Specifically, I'm being a little parochial now from the Navy. I don't have the same confidence that General Mingus does with the Army munitions in the Navy portion. And we're learning those lessons, right?
Are you thinking about sort of long-range?
Long-range missiles.
Like LRASMs or
LRASMs, Standard Missiles, SM-6, SM-3. You know, we've used our first SM-3 in conflict at the same event we talked about in defense of Israel. So those are complex, expensive munitions to build. So we have to have some capacity there. And I think we've got very comfortable. I got comfortable in a former life as an N9 going to minimum sustaining route. And that's unsat. It's unacceptable. Because right now we're in a position where we have to recertify missiles, turn those missiles quicker, and build missiles faster. So to me, wholly unsatisfying. There is a little bit of a shift, though, with things like a replicator and creating this hybrid force that can work together with our other manned aircraft or ships or soldier detachments to provide that effect. And I think we just need to kind of press into that space. We're uncomfortable, but we need to press.
On the, this idea of expanding the industrial base, part of that is opening up our industrial base to perhaps different ways of operating. Admiral Kilby talked about unmanned platforms. This afternoon, there will be a public announcement. The Air Force is awarding.
I was going to ask you about this, by the way. You just stole my question.
Yeah. Well, go ahead and ask the question.
No, it's okay.
No, I want to give you credit for it. Go ahead.
I'll just say CCA ?
Yes. Thanks for asking, Seth. This afternoon, the Air Force will be announcing 2 option awards to vendors that have been part of our CCA Increment 1 acquisition program that's been underway now for some time. And the idea here is as autonomy and as AI advances, it's allowing us to do things with platforms that previously required a human in the middle of the platform to make it happen that we're able to now move away from, much as Admiral Kilby's talking about with surface vessels. We're seeing the same thing with air vessels and so air vehicles. So we're really excited about the opportunities that are ahead of us with this CCA Increment 1 announcement this afternoon.
So stay tuned.
I really appreciate Admiral Kilby highlighting the challenges with shipyard capacity. The Coast Guard is building several new classes of Coast Guard cutters. We're in our largest shipbuilding effort since World War II. And, the Navy, the Coast Guard, MARAD, and others should not have to compete for shipyard capacity. And so I hope we can expand the defense industrial base. But I think it also goes beyond just new ship construction. It also affects ship repair. There's also limited capacity for dry docks and for the sustainability that we need to keep these assets in the fight.
Can I ask both of you? I realize there are political sensitivities to the issue of allies and partners, but we have a number of allies and partners with shipbuilding capacity, the Japanese, the Koreans, and others. And I know, visiting Yokosuka recently, we deploy with our Japanese colleagues. They're actually quite good. But how do we leverage, or can we leverage allied capacity when it comes to shipbuilding?
Well, from my perspective, I'm inspired by our American workforce in our U.S. shipyards. I think they do incredible work. I think they're incredible craftsmen. What I would like to see is investment through maritime statecraft in expanding U.S. labor capacity. The U.S. Shipbuilding industry is facing many of the same challenges we are in recruiting and retaining talent. So my hope is through the Maritime Statecraft Initiative, which Secretary Del Toro has included us in, we'll find a way to incentivize an expansion of shipbuilding capacity so we don't have to ask that question, because I do think we get incredible quality from American craftsmen.
But in order to complete the righteous cycle, whether it's industrial capacity, the means of production, and a labor force to complete the cycle, you've got to have a plan out there that attracts workers, that can see the ability to grow from an apprentice to a journeyman to a master. They'll bring their families, they'll study at your schools, they'll worship at your churches, and make that cycle complete. But if you don't show them the headlights, and you're $18 an hour at Starbucks, $18 an hour as a journeyman welder, why would I break my back in a shipyard instead of asking if you want room for cream? 3 years down the road, though, if that career is there, 5, 10 years down the road, if that career is there, that $18 is turned into something 3x, 4x, 5x, and now you're knocking on the door of master. There's a career there. So it's what's first, the chicken or the egg. I think they're both concomitant, but it's a cycle that needs to be invested in by both sides.
And that industry is going through a massive transformation about bringing a green workforce into a more mature, experienced workforce. That's going to take time. It's going to take commitment. It's going to take all the things for them to see that and stick and transfer and allow us to have not 5 years of experience at the supervisor level, but 15 years of experience at the supervisor level. We're in that space now, trying to kind of rewrite that and correct that imbalance. Massive investments in the submarine industrial base to get after this, right? To create that, because we're
including with the workforce.
Yeah, we're in it. Well, and it's not just buying parts; it's building the workforce and creating the system that can meet the demand signal. We have now a commitment across the UK, Australia, and the US to take our submarine building industrial base between our three countries and make it better by making the whole better than the sum of its parts. That gets at what General Mahoney talked about. But there's an investment to go do that.
So we've got a bunch of questions from the audience. Thanks to those who have asked them. I wanted to start with, I'll probably direct this at General Mahoney first and then open it up to anybody else that wants to answer it. So here's the question. Precision fires have become ubiquitous. We've talked a little bit about this, but I think this is a more focused question. Precision fires have become ubiquitous, but the capacity to hide and find targets is increasingly contested. Those capabilities, exquisite sensors, and C2 battle management software, waveforms, algorithms are intangible and difficult to reveal to competitors. Is this a problem for deterrence? How can we credibly show China our JAD-C2 is better than theirs, or that we can find and fix their concealed targets? How do we reveal to deter in the information age?
I think first you have to have a structure that militates toward movement, maneuver, decoy, deception, exploitation of the EM spectrum, and demonstrate that on a day-to-day basis to advantage. As far as conceal and reveal, that would be a choice at the time of our choosing to where we think we would have a deterrent effect by revealing that. You all saw a picture of the Army's MDTF unrolling in the Philippines right now. That reveal, although the existence of the system was not new, but the existence of the system in an expeditionary environment has a deterrent effect. A Marine littoral regiment that is able to move, maneuver, and sustain in the littorals and bring its combat power in a credible way with precision fires and the ability to, importantly, connect back to the fleet, connect back to the joint force, whether it's space, whether it's airborne, whether it's surface, I think is the kind of thing that will bring a deterrent factor to the equation. You got to have it, you got to train to it, and you have to show that you have a level of competency there.
I want, on a less strategic level, an investment across the joint force in a live, virtual, constructive training environment is paramount. We've been on this journey in the Navy. We want to be able to train our strike groups and our amphibious readiness groups at sea, not attached to a range on the United States, where we can maintain currency proficiency, where we don't have to divulge our tactics, where we don't have to divulge our systems. Up until recently, we've had to kind of retract back and reset our force, because we didn't want people to watch our tactics. And I use a capability called Navy Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air as an example. So the ability to do this within a security environment is first and foremost. Then you have the ability to demonstrate that when you choose. But I have to have that enduring thing, because the training part, it gets lost in the sauce when we talk about this, that I have to prize currency and proficiency, because at this integrated level, that is varsity ball. And I've got to train to it and be proficient at it and understand it. And that's what that environment brings us.
And the asset example of another joint project. So we worked with the Navy and took their TLAM and figured out a way to shoot it from the land, along with some other systems out to 2,000 kilometers. So think about, land force being able to hold targets at risk out to 2,000 kilometers, pretty profound. But going back to the original question, though, so the four elements of the character of war: who you fight, where you fight, what do you fight with, and how do you fight. Those last two components, as we think through, just the example of what we unveiled in the Philippines, the how you fight and what you fight with. We have traditionally, when we establish we commonly refer to it as the battlefield architecture, or the geography associated in a construct of a deep and a close and a support area, and those ranges have traditionally been in the close fight between 10 and 20, 30 kilometers. All that is going to expand. How we see, where we see, how far we see, and how far we can kill is moving at ranges that we have not been able to do previously. And so it's not necessarily the how. Those fundamentals will remain the same, but what we fight with, the ranges. So expansion and compression happening simultaneously is something that we've all got to figure out going forward. Because even though those things have expanded, there will be potentially cyber effects or space effects in the backyard of a Marine or an Army company or platoon that are happening in their backyard that we hadn't seen before. And so compression is happening at the same time as expansion. We think it's new, but if you go back to Baghdad and the density of how we were operating inside of Baghdad, we didn't call it these things back then, but we were operating at the company, platoon, battalion level, things that the theater army was bringing or theater forces were bringing right in those backyard.
You want to jump in on reveal?
No.
Or conceal?
It's okay to say no.
If you're not going to reveal it, it doesn't have any deterrent effect. And Mo said that. And that's really where we struggle from a space perspective is we're fairly new at this game. We don't have a lot of kit. And we wrestle with how much kit do I want to reveal? And if I'm going to reveal it, does it have a deterrent effect? And if I'm going to reveal it, can I protect and defend it? So we're constantly having that dialogue internal. I do want to build on, there's a theme here that keeps coming through, and it kind of deals a little bit with that is, and Mo said, you're going to be seen. We're going to see you, guaranteed. I don't care where you are on the planet, if you're even on the poles up in the Arctic or the Antarctic, we're going to see you. The other thing that Jim said is we're going to be able to touch you. Long-range fighters are going to be able to touch you now. We are closing those kill chains, which are now becoming kill webs, because of the integration amongst all of us, which gets back to the reason we have data, which gets back to all that. And as we get into this conversation about reveal and conceal, it's no longer about one service revealing or concealing something. It's about all of us revealing or concealing something to support the joint fight. It's no longer about integrating data on one platform or upgrading one platform. We're all dependent on the same platforms. If we go look at Aegis has a space control or a space domain awareness function to it. THAAD has a space domain awareness function to it. If we look at what just happened in the Middle East with what we were able to achieve, all those systems were integrated and networked together. We were picking out all of the launches with the missile warning system from the overhead architecture and immediately passing that down to Aegis, immediately passing it back down to the cockpits of our airplanes, immediately passing it out to our allies going forward. So when we really start talking about deterrence, we have to test and we have to train in a virtual environment so that we don't reveal a lot of our capabilities until we're ready, then go test them and demonstrate them in a live environment, because that's what's going to deter the adversary to understand that our JADC2 is better than theirs.
Seth, there's a really critical point in what General Gutlein's describing here, and that is the shift that is underway in from platform level integration to system level integration. You know, historically, we focus on the platform. And so if we want, you know, in the case of the Air Force, you want an airplane that has a range of this far, that can see this far and so forth, there are a set of derived requirements that come out of that. Well, it has to carry this much fuel. It has to have this big a wing. The radar has to be this big. The, you know, missile has to, you know, have this range. All of that is integrated at the platform level. You know, you can pick your example from any service to see what platform level integration looks like. We're really, really good at it. But there's a shift underway to system level integration, where the sensor is in a different place than the shooter, is in a different place from the electromagnetic spectrum effects that we're going to generate. All of these things have to be integrated at a system level, and it becomes a much less service by service, platform by platform approach to how we're going to fight. To General Mingus's point about the character of war is changing. This is, I think, the shift from platform level integration to systems level integration going on across all of our services is the most fundamental shift in the character of war that's underway right now.
It's about the quality and accuracy of data, period.
Yep.
The Aegis system used to default to it used to drive you to an organic track. Initially it was spy quality 7, then spy quality 15. Ballistic missile defense mission brought in the ability to accept a TPY2 track or a track from space. And so now I'm interested in my system discerning the best data and the most timely data to close that fire control loop. And maybe even predicting in the future that availability of that data sometime in the future to close that, to give me confidence that I can expend this weapon.
So Jim mentioned the other interwar period, but between World War I and World War II, the Germans took the tank, the airplane, and the radio and put those three things together. And between 1939 and 1941, we know what happened. So all the things that we've talked about, he who or she who can put all those things together in a meaningful way is going to have a distinct advantage on the adversary.
And then can maneuver based
Yes.
on that. One broad question to all of you, maybe we start with you, is we've seen the introduction of nuclear weapons at least being raised. The Russians have rattled the nuclear sabers several times. Putin has in the Ukraine war. If you look at the development, the nuclear developments of the Chinese, they are building nuclear capabilities. There's no question about that, and they continue to build nuclear capabilities. How is that impacting deterrence, but also warfighting? Now that we've got adversaries that are building capacities and even threatening in some cases to use them, what kind of challenge does that pose to you? I mean, how are you? How has that caused you to rethink things, or has it?
It has, and it really starts with the world we live in. we went from a bipolar balanced world to a unipolar unbalanced world to now a multipolar balanced and I think unbalanced simultaneously environment, which is going to affect all of us in terms of how we think about national security as Western nations going forward. But at the end of the day, from a land force perspective, where we, I think, fit into that component of it is still mastery of all the things we just talked about. Because if you still have, for us, squads and platoons and battalions and brigades and divisions that can close with and destroy anybody in the world in the most extreme lethal ways that we can determine, that is still your greatest deterrent force for the adversaries that are out there. The flip side of that, those are, when you get into the contest of wills and the nature of war, which is, separate from the character of war, and a different thing that is really hard to predict when you introduce the use of strategic nuclear weapons.
Anybody else want to jump on that?
I just think we need to pay attention to it. It's not a place where many of the conventional forces live and have an experience. In the Navy, it's our nuclear SSBN force that has deep experience in that area. And over the past 5 years, we've tried to integrate that view into our conventional view too, and understanding what's happening. What's happening from a strategic perspective? What's happening with the adversary? What is their level of behavior? Hey, I see a step up here. What does that mean? And what does it mean to me? And working across STRATCOM, NORTHCOM, and the geographic combatant commanders to put all that together is an area we're going to be increasingly pushed into.
I was reminded, reading about it recently, the Pentomic Division that the U.S. had looked at during the Cold War that failed, but as an attempt to be creative in how to fight. General Gould, and if I could come to you, it's a related question, but there's been growing concern about the proliferation of offensive counterspace capabilities that could be used to disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy space systems. How serious, in your assessment, are adversary counterspace capabilities, direct descent, co-orbital, directed energy, and how are you thinking about mitigating some of those threats?
So I think they're very serious threats. What makes it even more challenging is not only is our near peers showing that they are capable, but in many cases also they have the intent to deny our ability to use space. So that makes it for a very real threat that we are concerned about. The other thing that we're seeing is it's not a single threat vector. We're seeing the threat vector across multiple areas, like you said, directed energy, co-orbital, direct descent, jammers, blinders. We're seeing the entire spectrum of capabilities when it comes to counterspace, which makes it challenging to do protect and defend. Jim kind of started talking a little bit about air superiority, and it used to be from an air superiority perspective, we had undeniable air superiority across the entire theater, if not across the entire globe. We are not going to have that in space. What we're going to see in space is very selected space superiority over very selected areas for very selected points in time. And that's really the way we're having to start think about space superiority, because it's just so big. The threat is so varied, and it's not just one country. We're seeing it across multiple countries, and other countries that are not currently in that business are trying to get into that business. So it's getting real.
We're not trying to build the best services on the planet. We're trying to build the best joint force on the planet, because we don't fight as services. We fight as a joint force. And I think one of the things that is the collection of us have kind of really become deeply immersed in how interdependent we are. The thing that underpins much of this, as we've talked about, is our ability to operate in and through space, as well as our ability to protect our assets while at the same time degrading adversary space assets. And so how we think about things like space superiority, I think, is not a Space Force question. It's a joint force question. Yeah. And the Space Force is clearly, an integral part of that. But I think all of us have come to appreciate how heavily dependent we are.
One question from the audience, which I'll direct to you, Admiral Poulin, if that's okay, is it's a gray zone question. One of Beijing's biggest takeaways from watching Russia for the last 17 years, the questioner notes, may be that the world is much less likely to react to incremental hybrid aggression than to an outright invasion. How should the U.S. strategically address China's increasing gray zone aggression in the South China Sea and in Southeast Asia, given our partnerships and interests there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it starts with just illuminating the belligerent behavior and how that behavior is inconsistent with international law. And I think the second thing is being present and meeting our partners where they're at. From the Coast Guard's perspective, when we look at many of the Pacific Island nations in particular, and frankly other nations, when you talk to them about what their greatest national security challenges are, it's about protecting their exclusive economic zone, it's about transnational criminal organizations, it's about dealing with the effects of climate change, and it's about how do you respond to natural disasters. And all of that goes to what I was talking about before, maritime governance. So if you can be present, whether it's in a Coast Guard cutter or a gray hull, or whether it's a mobile training team or a law enforcement detachment, you're really meeting the partners where they are at in addressing some of their greatest national security concerns. And when you do that, you start to build capacity and you start to squeeze out opportunity for other belligerent behavior. So presence matters, reinforcement of international law, and approaching this from a combined perspective and not a unilateral perspective is critically important as well. So, that's how I would see us competing and pushing back against some of the belligerent behavior that we've seen. Reinforcing to partners that we will be there, we'll support, we'll be present, we'll engage, and we'll be there in an enduring way.
Gosh, Seth, if only there was somebody on the panel that knew something about irregular warfare and perhaps had written about it.
Perhaps, yes.
Again.
A couple of other questions. I'm not going to ask this to anybody specific, but just sort of to the group in general. This questioner says, how are the services addressing recruitment shortfalls? I mean, how are you dealing with some of the personnel challenges you have across the services?
Well, you're looking at me, I'll take that one. There's two sides to having the force you want, getting the force you want, at least from the beginning stages. One is to access people, to recruit them. The other is to keep them. In the Marine Corps, our retention rates have been at historic levels for first-term retention, and our goals for subsequent re-enlistments are also at very high levels. Accession, I think, for all of us has been really, really hard. The recruiting command calls it headwinds, but our approach is pretty simple. You have a brand and you protect it. You have standards, you don't lower them. And what we do is we take the best officers and staff NCOs we have, we board them, we qualify them, we train them, and we put them into the recruiting force. We incentivize them on the front end to volunteer. We incentivize them while they're in the job. And then when they get out, we incentivize them as well. And what we found when they come from the recruiting command, they're some of the best officers and staff NCOs in subsequent jobs that we have. So you protect the brand, you don't lower your standards, and you bring the pros from Dover into the game, and you'll make your mission.
We're having a very solid recruiting year. In fact, to the point where we have just upped our estimate of what we believe we can assess into the Air Force this year. And one of the things that has enabled us to be particularly successful is, to General Mahoney's point, you don't lower the standard, but one of the things that we have done is we have looked at norms. There's a difference between norms and standards. And so we have had a norm that requires driver's licenses. And, the youth of today, many of them don't have driver's licenses, which has artificially restricted the recruiting pool. Now, what is the standard that requires a driver's license before you join the Air Force? And what we've discovered is that this isn't really a standard for almost all of our career fields. It's just a norm that we have accepted for years and years. And so when you kind of strip away things that are frankly not relevant to the force you're trying to attract, it opens the pool of eligible recruits, and the Air Force has had a very successful year thus far.
I would say we all have the same challenges, maybe different than the Marine Corps. With Navy, we have A, B, and C zones. So A is 1 through 6 years, B is 6 through 10 years, C is 10 beyond. Retention, we're pretty good in A and C. We're not as good in B. For recruiting, all hands on deck, and it's what Jim talked about, is where is there slop in the system? How can I tighten down on the timeline from contact to contract and make that connection? And maybe a re-emphasis on this, because it's a super existential threat to all of us, that we need to bring in that force to sustain our force. So it's got full attention in the Navy.
I think for us, it's about getting into areas where the Coast Guard hasn't recruited in the past. And, you know, I've been doing this for 40 years, and I've never seen the challenges that we have in recruiting talent. So what we're doing is we're expanding capacity, professionalizing our recruiting program. We're also looking to break down barriers to service. That's not reducing standards, but it's evaluating why we have certain standards that before may have prevented entry, but now don't make sense. Colorblindness may be one of those standards. For example, there's certain things you can do. If you're colorblind, there's certain things you can't do, but it should not necessarily be a bar to service. And the other thing that we're doing is we're expanding the opportunities for people to come in laterally into the Coast Guard, whether you're prior service or whether you're out there in the private sector and have a particular skill set and want to serve in the Coast Guard. We'll find an opportunity to bring you in. And just if you'll bear with me, the mental image is, think about a Jenga tower. If a Jenga tower is what you need for a second-class petty officer, you take somebody who wants to come in through the lateral entry program and you look at what Jenga pieces they're missing. And then what you do is you focus your training enterprise on filling those Jenga pieces, and you can much more quickly elevate somebody to a second-class petty officer that perhaps you didn't before. So it's about being smarter about recruiting and retaining talent. And we have to speak to people in a different way as well. I think from my perspective, young men and women want to know that they can make a difference, that they're valued, and that they can serve in unique and different ways. And so we're talking to them about that within the context of the Coast Guard.
I know we're at the end of our time, but if anybody else wants to jump in on that.
Just from a national perspective, a couple things I'd add. One is, for all of us, the trajectories on propensity to serve and eligibility to serve are not moving in the right direction. And so for all the reasons that have been described, the Joint Force has taken a hard look at, how do we recruit? Who do we recruit? Where do we go after expanded populations, not just high schoolers, but at the micro level in the Army has been very successful for us, and to get after Mo's point about standards. Physical and mental acuity and cognitive, an individual may have tons of aptitude and potential, but they may not quite be there today. And so we bring them through our Future Soldiers Prep course, and we bring them to our standard, which has opened up a whole new set of demographics that we're able to recruit and go after, who have gone on and done very, very well in the Army on the back end of that.
Navy's taken a page out of the Army's book there. We haven't had the course up and running, the academic course, to understand what our success will be there. But from a physical perspective, we have 850 sailors that we wouldn't have had if we just had our old standards. We have a physical course to put you in to get you to that standard because we want you to serve.
Well, great. Well, thanks to all of you. If you could join me in thanking our esteemed panel. We really appreciate all of you coming. Just as a reminder, we will take a break right now, and at 11:30, in 11 minutes, we will have the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, that will be on stage. So thanks again to all of you, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Seth.
Thanks, Seth.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thanks, everybody. That was great.
That was great.